Today's webinar will be presented by Gidget Pryor, Global Knowledge Solutions Engineer. Gidget has worked in a number of roles throughout her professional career. She's worked as a network administrator, a programmer, a developer, a DBA, an analyst, and a business intelligence consultant. In her current role, Gidget focuses on solutions for companies and individuals as they pursue new and enhanced skills, as well as certifications, particularly in the area of Microsoft. Today, we will learn about next steps now that the MCSA, MCSE, and MCSD certification tracks are retired, how to map your current certifications to the new role-based certifications, and the logical next steps, depending on the certification path you are pursuing. Gidget, it's all yours. We can begin.
Thank you, Chris. All right, so today we're going to address, in our agenda, we're going to address what role-based certification is, in case you're not familiar with it, why Microsoft created the role-based certification and how it is a departure from the traditional legacy certifications like the MCSA and MCSE, what you should expect as you prepare and become certified. We'll also look at some practical tips, some certification tips and strategies. We'll look at expected and unexpected benefits that occur through the certification process. We'll look at certification as it relates to your career advancement. And then we'll look at the role of training, what training does and does not do as you are preparing to get certified, and some tactical practical things on taking a Microsoft exam. So we're going to address this from a theoretical standpoint as well as a very practical standpoint. So what is role-based certification? Role-based certification is the certification that focuses around the actual technical role and the requirements of that role. So it takes a look at something like an administrator or a developer or a DevOps professional or a data engineer and says, what are the types of things that that person would be doing in a typical environment? It is a certification track that's designed to prove your competency in a specific technical area. In the past, we had the certification was really addressing kind of topical areas. So for example, you could get certified in Windows Server Administration or Windows Desktop, or you could get certified in SQL Server Administration or query performance tuning, something of that nature. Whereas here, it takes a more comprehensive look at the overall role. What does it mean to be an administrator, an architect, or a data engineer? The role-based certification are divided into different topical areas, as you can see here. So developer, data engineer, DevOps engineer, Microsoft has a number of these certifications that are available. And if you were to go out to Microsoft Learn, which is where this picture came from, and you were to click on any of these, it would take you down into the details of that. So do you need one exam? Do you need two exams? Is there a prerequisite exam that goes to that certification? It would show you all of those things, as well as the skills that will be measured on your test. Why did Microsoft create the role-based certification? They really created it to focus more comprehensively on the role, not just the topic area. So legacy certifications focused on topical areas, whereas the role-based certification focuses more on the job role. It takes a look at the typical person who is an administrator, the typical person that is an architect, and what are the types of things that they do in their day-to-day activities. Architects, for example, might have many responsibilities, not just the ones that are obvious. So they could have a responsibility to also participate in some of the DevOps work, or they might be managing SQL servers in the cloud, or they might be architecting whether we're going to use a SQL database or we're going to use an Azure SQL virtual machine. So they might have a lot of different responsibilities, not just the ones that we would typically think of as an architect, like security. What should you expect as you prepare to become certified? I personally have taken and passed somewhere around 100 exams, not all Microsoft for sure. Microsoft is not even quite half that, but um, you should expect as you go into this type of certification that you should expect to achieve your goal. You want to go in knowing that it's going to be probably a difficult journey. I'm not a great test taker, even though I've taken and passed a lot of exams. It's a lot of work for me every single time. So expect to achieve your goal. The exams are very difficult. They're designed to be meaningful, and therefore they need to be difficult. Not everyone should be able to just walk in and pass easily. Make sure that you do allocate enough time to prepare. So, a long time ago, Global Knowledge used to teach boot camps. And in the boot camps, we still have boot camps, but in the boot camps, we would have people take their exams. So you would have, perhaps a day of lecture and lab. You would have another maybe half day, and then half a day to prepare for the exam, to look at study questions, test questions, talk about the types of things you're going to see on the exam. And then you'd go take a test, which was very difficult on the instructor. I taught a lot of those, and also very difficult on the student, because the expectation is that you're just going to easily be able to have 2 days of material and go in and pass. And that in a lot of cases is not realistic. The student would need to come in with a lot of experience, a lot of preparedness already to be able to take and pass those exams. So the average for a person is going to be probably a month or two to study per exam. So it does take time in addition to coming to a course, and we'll address that a little bit later in the webinar. Study systematically, and I'm going to give you some tips about how to do that. Pass rates vary per exam. So I've had some exams that I wasn't necessarily that prepared, but I was able to go in and pass the exam. And then other things, I actually failed an exam in an area where I had over 20 years of experience in that. I had practical, hands-on consulting experience, and I went in and I failed the exam by a part of a question. So it was one of those like choose two or choose all that apply types of questions, and I missed it by 9 points. So it's been several years ago, but I still remember exactly what the problem was. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's, every exam is equal. The architect exams currently are probably some of the most difficult exams. So if that is an exam set, there's 2 exams that you are studying for, you want to allocate more time to that. Microsoft doesn't publish the pass rates, but we just know from experience of students that have come through Global Knowledge. Certification is not the same as skills, but there's overlap. Like you do need some practical, real world, hands-on experience if you're going to be able to go in and get certified. But just because you have the practical hands-on experience, the example I just gave you, doesn't mean that you will easily be able to go in and get your certification. Sometimes your experience may go against you. You're like, well, they're asking me to do this on the test, but that's not how I would really accomplish that goal in my job, or not really the best practice of the way to do it. So some certification tips and strategies. Consider what certification you even want to get. Look at the areas of technology that are growing inside your company. Maybe you want career advancement within the company. What's growing? What's popular? Look at training company websites for things that are popular courses or popular certifications. And then, of course, you want to get certified in something that interests you. For a period of time, about 18 months, I was a network administrator, and I did fine in that role, but I didn't love it. I mean, it did not fascinate me to install a service pack and see something got fixed and something else broke. I didn't enjoy that work. I loved being a DBA, however. I loved doing development work. I loved creating websites. So things that are of interest to you are probably going to be easier for you to get certified. And then get certified in areas that help your employer. In many cases, your employer is probably the one paying for your certification. So find out what's going to be useful to them. I do strongly advise that you use exam prep software. So both Measure Up and Kaplan IT are really good. Whiz Labs is also really good. In much of the testing software, there is an opportunity to start the exam in the exam immediately, which means that you'll fail the practice exam, but we're going to use it as a study tool. So we want to start it and end it so that we can go look at the questions and the answers and the explanations about why they picked what they picked. You're not there to try to memorize the questions and answers. That's not what you're going to see on the exam. So use it as a study tool first, and then go back and use it as an exam prep to see if you can actually take and pass the practice test. When you do that, you are learning through that process. There's oftentimes a link to a white paper or a website where you can get more information if you didn't fully understand why they chose what they chose. And it keeps you from memorizing the exam prep software. If you start out using it as exam prep, you just go take the practice exam. There's a limited test bank of questions. So let's say they have 150 questions, for example. You will eventually, as you go through that multiple times, you'll eventually start to memorize those. And then you'll think, well, did I get that right because I now know that's the right answer? Or did I get it right because I really comprehend and understand that concept? And if I saw it in a different context, I would still get it right. Use the test requirements to guide your studying. If you go out to Microsoft, and if we have time at the end of the webinar, I'll take you out there. Otherwise, you can just go out to MS Learn and click on one of those tiles. If you go out to Microsoft, there is a skills objectives, and you want to take a look at those objectives. And literally, when I study for a test, I go through and I say, okay, they're asking me to be able to create tables in the database environment. Do I know how to create tables? And do I know how to do that graphically as well as in syntax? Is that something that I am capable of doing? And I don't go take the exam until I can check off everything that's on that skills objectives. If I haven't seen that concept, I'm not familiar with it, I don't go to the test yet, because they are going to expect you to know those areas. And frankly, they can ask you anything they want to about the product. And every product that Microsoft has, especially with cloud services and how often things change now, uh, it's a challenge to be able to learn that. So make sure that you are prepared using that skills objectives. Think like the test writer, not like a test taker. Like, what was the test writer thinking? What was their intention as they created this question? What are they trying to get at? What are they trying to help you prove you know? Pick the best answer. I remember many years ago, I was taking a test, and there's something that it's called a cursor, and it is the T-SQL of last resort, right? Microsoft even uses that language. Like, you want to try to solve your problem any other way that you can. But I got a question that said, cursor was one of the answers, and I had 4 answers, and cursor was the only thing in the context of the question. It was the only thing that would work. And I'm like, but that's not right. Like, they tell us themselves not to choose that. But it was the best answer, and it was the only answer that was going to work in that context. So don't argue with the test. Don't sit there and say, but you wouldn't really do it that way in the real world. You only have the answers that you have to be able to choose from. Lean toward affirmative answers. I have found that this serves you well. Oftentimes, you will have more right answers that are affirmative. Exams are very much about reading comprehension. They are about reading comprehension probably as much or more as they are about the technology. They may say, choose the best answer or choose all of the answers that are correct. They may say questions 1 through 5, you can go back and forth between. Questions 5 through 10, you can't, or 6 through 10, you can't move back and forth. So read carefully what they are suggesting and what they're trying to tell you. Also use pattern matching techniques to compare answers. So on many tests, not all of them, but on many tests, you can mark a question for review. And if you don't know the answer, I suggest you do that. Mark it for review. Don't leave anything blank at the end. You want to make sure you answer all the questions, because if you don't answer it, you get it wrong. If you answer it incorrectly, you don't somehow get it double wrong. You just still get it wrong. But you may come across a question later on in the test that reminds you of something, and now you're able to go back and answer that particular question. If you have a long question, oftentimes there are scenario types of questions. If you have a long question, usually the subject matter closest to the question itself is a priority. And these are just things I've learned. And I actually prepared this slide deck originally with another instructor. We were trying to think of all the ways, all the strategies that we've learned over the years on Microsoft exams. Keywords in the question often will point you to the correct answer. Spend time answering the questions that you have the best opportunity to get right. You will see things on the exam, you're like, I don't even know what that is. I once took the Vista exam when it came out. I had not used Vista. I hadn't studied Vista. I didn't know hardly anything about Vista, but I had an exam voucher that was going to expire. So I decided that I would go in and just try it. And I had a free retake. So I thought, I'll go see what's on it. And I have a free retake. So it's fine if I don't pass. And I actually scored very well on the exam, but I was completely guessing on much of the test, just completely guessing. I was like, that sounds like what Microsoft would call it. But I just didn't have that kind of pressure. But in general, that's not a good strategy. Like, you want to go in and be fully prepared. I would never have done that way, except that my voucher was about to expire and I didn't have anything else I needed to test on. So don't waste time on questions that you don't know or you don't understand. If you haven't seen it before, it's fine. I mean, Microsoft has literally hundreds of people working on the development of any product. I once heard a stat from Microsoft saying that they had over 900 people that had worked on the upgrade of this product. 900, and they had spent 5 years in the development cycle, 900 of them. The chance that any one of us is going to know everything is very, very slim. And no one of them probably knows everything either. Don't change your answer. Oh, excuse me, I missed one. Do answer every question. Okay, if you don't answer the question, you'll get it wrong. Make sure that you do give an answer to every question. Even if you marked it for review, make sure you go back and fill in an answer. Don't change your answers. Oftentimes the questions are designed to make you second guess yourself. So just know that that is happening. It might be easier to eliminate answers than to choose the correct answer. In the scenario I gave you, it was like, well, this is the T-SQL of last resort. It's not a good thing to do. However, it's the only thing that works. I eliminated everything else. So let's take a look at some of the expected benefits of certification. Certification increases your job opportunities. So the need for IT professionals, as I'm sure you know, is increasing, not decreasing. Certification increases your earning potential. There is industry demand for personnel that can demonstrate skills in particular areas, especially the role-based certifications, especially cloud, things that are in high demand like data and AI, architecting in the cloud. Preparing for the exam will force you to study things that you might not study otherwise. Years ago, I was on a consulting project and I happened to be studying for an exam, and I read about something called snapshot isolation. And in the paragraph that I read, it said readers don't block writers and writers don't block readers. And I said, perfect. That's exactly the problem I'm facing on this project I'm doing. And so kind of naively, I went and just implemented that, and it happened to work out great in my case. But what I didn't continue to read was that there were some other challenges for doing that. In my case, it didn't end up hurting me, but it did give me, because I was studying, it did give me a solution to something I was facing in the real world. It does force you to broaden your skills, to address some scenarios that are maybe in your company, something that you've heard of, and now you can see the solution as you begin to study. I've included this link here, the 10 benefits of IT certification. There are many benefits, but we have a white paper that has listed 10 benefits for you. There are also some unexpected benefits of certification. Certification increases your networking possibilities, both from a personal and corporate perspective. I was at a conference, I was there doing some marketing, but I was at a Microsoft conference that was focused on an area that wasn't really my focus. And I sat down at this, table at lunch with a bunch of strangers that I'd, never met, and they were talking, but because I had some context, I was able to enjoy a conversation with them, even though that wasn't my specific area of technology. Certification helps make your company more competitive in the sales and bidding process. Oftentimes, companies, especially if they're consulting firms, will have a requirement for the number of people that need to be certified in order to obtain something like a gold partner status. It also increases opportunities to obtain government contracts. There's oftentimes requirements on the government contracts for people that are certified. It gives you a new body of knowledge and lets you know what's possible. There's probably things in the product that you're not currently using, but it might help you solve a future problem that you'll face. Just being aware that it exists. Experience is the greatest teacher. Certification rounds out your knowledge and it establishes you as a continuous learner. I know I had a bunch of exams retire as the MCSA, MCSE, and MCSD went away February 1st. And it was like, oh my goodness, the starting over. Some of you may be in that position where you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm starting over. However, you've established yourself as a continuous learner if you've achieved other certifications in the past. So continue forward and pursue the new role-based certifications. It also forces discipline and diligence. So just the process of making yourself study helps you as you develop that, discipline muscle. Certification can open up new opportunities to you, new communities, like technical chapters where you can learn from other people. I know that for SQL Server, there's a SQL Pass conference and there's SQL Pass chapters that are very helpful where you can continue to learn. All right, so let's talk about certification and your career advancement. Being certified shows that you have some distinction from other people that are not certified. I had someone ask me recently, like, well, what do you think about certification? What's your opinion? Because they saw that I had a lot of different credentials. And it's sort of odd to me to have my credentials listed anywhere. Like I don't put it in my signature line. Because I think, well, certification in and of itself, in my opinion, is not very valuable. I mean, it's sort of valuable, but certification and experience are extremely valuable because you have proven that you have some experience and you have proven that you have the discipline and the diligence to be able to get your certification and that you have the intelligence to be able to get the certification as well. Certification might open up more opportunities on either your current team or another team within your company. And you have new information that you'll be able to utilize. You will study things that you've probably not come across before. It does give you additional areas of competency if you do utilize what you've learned. Okay. And you may learn through the certification process that there's a feature, but you learn, yes, this feature exists, but here's the downside of that feature, and here's why we wouldn't want to implement it. So it's not necessarily that you put into practice everything that you've learned. The role of training as far as certification, training does a lot of things toward your certification. So we have two types of courses. We have skills-based courses that prepare the student for concepts that are going to be addressed as you go take the exam. All right. So if you come take the AZ 104 course from us, that is the Azure Administrator, you will face a lot of the content in that course that you're going to see on the exam. So the labs are related to it, the course is related to it, the course content, the lecture, it's related to the exam. But mostly that course is taught from a skills-based perspective. Like you need to know how to work with PowerShell in the cloud. You need to know how to deal with accounts in the cloud. Is that going to be on the exam? Yes, but it's addressing it from a skills-based perspective. So it gets you a long way toward the certification. And then we also have either boot camps or exam prep courses that are specifically designed to prepare you for the exam. It's saying, you remember that concept we talked about? Here's the types of questions you might get around that. You know, what happens when you combine different sets of permissions? What's the effective permission at the end? Global Knowledge does have both of these types of courses. So private training includes the skills-based, also exam prep and blended skills that could be followed by a specific exam prep solution. And then of course, in our open enrollment format, we have our skills-based classes and we have boot camps that are specifically focused around the exam. Official curriculum from businesses like Microsoft and some other companies that exist out there are focused on learning concepts as opposed to exam preparation. So when they create the curriculum, they're not creating it from an exam-based perspective. They are creating it from a skills perspective. Training also increases employee retention. Lots of surveys show that employees value that their employer will invest in them. So training is a benefit to the employee and it in turn benefits the employer because people have more knowledge and more understanding. Global Knowledge exclusives offer some ongoing learning. So for example, you may take a course and have a year of access to labs. Training does help you formulate questions. You may hear another student in the class ask a question and that makes you think of something that you want to add on. Or because they formulated the question the way they did, it helps you solve a particular solution, a particular issue you're facing. And it just exposes you to new topics. It also introduces new experiences. You may be in an open enrollment format and somebody from a different organization describes what they're doing and you have not previously experienced that. So it gives you some new experiences. It also facilitates the team integration. So if people have very specialized jobs, you know, it can help with that. I once worked in an organization where we had a lot of people that were on the SQL Server team. It was a huge company and we had a lot of people on the SQL Server team. We had one group of people that all they did all day long was backup and restore. I mean, I think that would be incredibly boring, but that's what they did. They did backup and restore for many other organizations, and that was their whole job. So they didn't have a lot of exposure to other parts of the product. Whereas the team I was on, we did a lot of development. They did our backup and restores for us. And so, you know, if we were to take a training class together and we were having a conversation, it's like we get to know more about what the other groups are doing. So what does training not do? Training by itself, I know that this is unpopular, but training by itself is not enough for certification. I would not recommend, especially with the role-based certifications, they're very difficult. I wouldn't recommend that you take a training class and then the next day you schedule your exam. You need some time in between to study. And if you look at the skills-based objectives, most of the time, if not all of the time, Microsoft will include something in the skills-based objectives that are not included in the course. So for example, in a SQL Server test, administration course does not have anything on high availability, but the test that is associated with it does ask about high availability. So that is something that you would need to study on your own. Training is not a substitute for experience, but it includes new experiences. And so your experience plus your training plus your study should result in your successful certification. Taking the Microsoft exam, just some practical things here. Most exams have between 45 and 55 questions, and the exam time is around 2.5 hours. It's scheduled for that. Now, in that, you have a little survey that happens at the beginning saying, how long have you used this product? How many years have you been in the industry? Those types of questions. And then they have a tutorial. And most of the time, the tutorials, I think, still has the calculator on it. And it's like, why do I need a calculator? Like, I'm not going to be calculating anything on the test, but there are some tests that have it, so it's just included in the tutorial. On most of the exams, 700 out of 1,000 is a passing score. Okay, you don't get any extra bonus, any extra badge from Microsoft if you score a 970 as opposed to a 700. Okay, I have actually gotten a perfect score before, but that's rare. It's really rare. And it didn't represent, like when I got it, it didn't really represent that I was so skilled in that particular area. I just got fortunate with the questions that I had on the exam. And I have, as I said, scored a 691 on something I had 20 years of experience in. So, but 700 is a passing score. Testing at home is available in some countries, probably everywhere right now. I don't know that that's true, but it does require that you have a clear workspace. You have to take pictures of your workspace to the left, to right, behind it. I think even like underneath. I haven't taken an exam at home, so I haven't taken anything in the last, say, year or so. Read the directions very carefully. I mentioned this before. You will find that directions look very similar, but maybe just slightly different. Like you can go back and forth between these questions, and then the next set of instructions say you cannot. Well, you wouldn't want to mark one of those for review because you can't go back to it. So pay very careful attention to what they are saying. Microsoft does have several different question formats, and they publish what these are. So I'm not giving away any secrets here. You may have questions that just ask you to choose one answer or choose multiple answers. Choose all that apply comes up pretty often. So it may be choose two or choose all that apply. And questions are not just A, B, C, and D necessarily. Sometimes they are. But I had on my business intelligence exams, I had some choose all that apply, A through M. And it was like, oh my goodness, I don't know on that. So it's not just A, B, C, and D. You don't just have a 25% chance if you guess necessarily. Drag and drop, you may need to put steps in correct order. So they may say, here's code samples, different snippets of code, and they want you to create a function out of that, and they want you to put the syntax in the correct order. Or they want you to patch a server, and they want to know what comes first and second and third, and so on. It may be yes and no. It may be a fill in the blank. So some of the coding exams, they'll ask you to actually write a little code sample. Those are pretty difficult to score, so we don't see a lot of those, but you may see some. They may ask you to configure an option on the screen. So they may give you a simulation with a dialog box, and you are supposed to configure the right steps. They may take you out to a live environment. Many of the role-based certification exams do have a live environment. They open up the Azure portal to you, and they say, please achieve these things. So you may be required to achieve those. And then they might have a simulation, which is not really completely a live environment, but looks a bit like it. It's a little more controlled within the live environment. So for more information, you can actually go out to this website and take a look. Many of the exams have labs that have 8 to 12 tasks in each lab. You want to pay very careful attention to the time so that you don't run out of time on those. Okay. After you leave the lab environment, you can't go back to it. If you go, oh no, I forgot to do X, you cannot go back to it. The time required for each of the labs might be very different. So one of them might take you 5 minutes and one might take you 20. If you know that there's, going to be 3 labs on there, don't count on them being the same. With regard to the difficulty of the exam questions, that is also something you should be aware of. Sometimes you will have a really hard question, a really hard question, a really hard question, and then you'll have something that's really easy. And you think, wait a minute, there must be a trick here that I'm not seeing. They vary greatly in terms of the level of difficulty and the level of thought that is required for a question. So don't let that, don't let that be a concern to you when you're in the exam. That's just the way it is. That is the way they have always done it since I've been getting certified. So time does have a role. So if you see an exam that has design in the title, design exams you need to pay very careful attention to your time. So they have what are called testlets. It's basically the small case studies within the test. You might have, say, 5 case studies, and one might have 9 questions, one might have 7 questions, one might have 11 questions, 12, whatever. So pay attention to those. If you get a design exam and it says, it has the case studies like that, and they have this long scenario that you're supposed to read, don't read the scenario first. Within a testlet, you can go back and forth. So within that testlet, just go through and look at those 9 questions. I mean, unless it tells you in the exam that you cannot. But go look at the questions first and then come back and read the scenario. If you read the scenario and you try to memorize all that information, a lot of it's not going to be relevant to the questions you're being asked. If you go look at the questions first, then you have in your mind, like, okay, I need to find in the scenario, they're asking me to do a backup. I need to find what kind of backup they're asking me to do based on the scenario information. But pay attention to the clock. Design exams are notorious for people running out of time, although the ones that have lab simulations on them, the same would be true. Failing an exam does not mean that you have a lack of knowledge or real world experience. So don't be overly discouraged. Nobody wants to fail an exam, but it happens. Passing an exam doesn't necessarily mean you've mastered the topic. I mean, it might mean that. You will know whether it means that you've mastered it. Like when I came out of the Vista exam and I had passed it, I was like, well, I still don't know anything. I just guessed. And then other times it's like, well, it doesn't mean that I didn't have 20 years of experience in that. I just missed it somehow by a part of a question. Not all questions require the same level of, they're not all equal in their level of difficulty. As I said, not all of them require the same level of effort. Some questions will go very fast. Other questions require a fair amount of time. When you get to the exam prep, to the exam itself, all the prep that you've done, all the studying that you've done, inevitably, the questions that you get the day of the test will probably seem harder than all the test prep that you did. Transcender, Measure Up, Whiz Labs, the level of difficulty in their questions is very much like what you'll see in the exam, but you just don't have the same pressure as you do when you're going to the exam. When I was teaching a lot of boot camps, there were a few times that I had somebody come to class and say, hey, if I don't pass this week, I'm not supposed to go back to work next week. I'm fired. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that's a lot of pressure. So the design exam, we already had that discussion. So just, going back and forth between those commandlets, looking at the scenarios, dealing with test anxiety. I have probably the worst test anxiety of anyone I've ever met. And I've had a lot of students come through boot camps. So it is something to be addressed. Some people don't have test anxiety. They're like, oh, well, whatever. But this is what I do for myself. Okay. So if you're in that boat and you have some test anxiety, focus on what you do know. When you come across a question that you don't know, you just say to yourself, I don't know everything, but I know a lot. And so I'm just going to focus on what I do know. I'm going to do the best I can with the things that I do know. Keep in mind how many people work on a single version of the product. No one knows everything. Utilize the review feature, as I mentioned. So mark it for review, go back to it. Draw pictures. So I don't know on the exams that you take from your house if you're allowed to do this, but when you go to an actual test site, and it's probably true as you are taking it from home, you can have a couple of pieces of paper and draw a picture. So if I start thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know the answer to this question, I refocus on the question and I say, you have a server named server 1. I will draw a little box for a server and I will label it server 1. And it helps refocus my mind, repurpose my mind to be toward the test. Don't create more anxiety for yourself by arguing with the exam, saying, well, they don't have the right answer here. Like the best way to do this is XYZ. You don't have that option. You only have the options that are in front of you. So use those. And you can take the exam again. Yes, it stinks to have to pay the money again for the exam. However, you can use it. You can go back and take the exam. All right, so that just about does it. We're going to be wrapping up. I'll take some questions if anybody has questions now. And then we have just a few more housekeeping tips. So with regard to the role-based certification, look at what your current discipline is. So maybe you've been an on-premise SQL Server DBA. You're going to move into the data topics, so the things that are kind of data, Power BI, Power Platform types of things. If you are Windows Server, you're going to be moving to something like Azure Administrator. So there is a match in the cloud role-based certifications for you. And it's a pretty easy, logical step. All right, any questions? Or if there's just something else you'd like for me to cover, I'll be glad to do that too.
While we wait on additional questions to be dropped into the Q&A, there were a couple of questions, a few that came in during the presentation. And while they were answered in the chat, Gidget, perhaps you'd like an opportunity to respond as well. The first was surrounding the best certification pathway for an Azure cybersecurity specialist.
Okay. I don't know why I'm not seeing them in my chat. So the best certification path, I would say if you have no Azure experience whatsoever, I would probably start out with Azure Fundamentals, or if you have some experience or just at least some knowledge, you could go right into something like Azure Administrator and then go into the Azure security track. So the AZ 104 and the AZ 500 would be a good path for you. Some people would say you can go straight to the AZ 500. That's a pretty challenging leap to go directly. So you want to have a good foundational understanding of Azure before you head into that security track.
That's great feedback, Gidget. I believe what the initial feedback we shared indicated the Azure 500 or AZ 500 for the security administration. But having that background as an Azure administrator, we've seen definitely provides value for those students when they work into those more specific areas of
Right.
Azure.
So it's a good thing to address here. Microsoft has what their recommended path is. And then we have what we have seen makes students successful. So a lot of times having that foundational knowledge, even though it may not be required for your particular track, it's very helpful. Like even somebody who is going in to be a data engineer can benefit from that AZ 104 course. So, and of course, something is wrong with my chat. So would you mind putting in the chat for everyone the my email address? So it's just gidget.prior@globalknowledge.com. And if you have any questions about a specific path or what might be a good background for you, please do email me and I'll be glad to respond to help you with that. We also at Global Knowledge have an offering that is called Polaris. Polaris Discovery Level gives you access to all of the Microsoft courses, and it also gives you access to some hands-on practical labs where you could, they're called challenge-based labs. And so you become increasingly confident and competent as you work through those. And those are very much like the simulations that you would see, or the actual live environment that you'll see on several of the Azure or cloud certifications. Were there other questions, Chris?
So one question was similar to the Azure Security Administration question we have just answered, but in general, what would you say would be the suggested certification track for a company that is just beginning to build their Azure cloud presence?
I would say Azure Administrator is a really good place to start for those people that may be becoming administrators, or just a general knowledge for everyone is the Azure Fundamentals. So AZ 900 is the Azure Fundamentals. And we do have two offerings. We have one that has labs with it and one that does not. I would take the one that has labs. So that is course code, I believe, 10667 for us. But it is the AZ 900. It's the 2-day offering.
Excellent. And what about the new security courses and security certifications that Microsoft has just announced, presuming the SC 900, SC 200, I believe?
Yeah, I haven't seen much detail around those. We are supposed to be getting some more information very soon. So if that's something that you all are interested in, again, just please email me. I expect to have some information between now and next week. And it's a good thing to bring up also, we have a webinar that's coming up next week that is around security, and Microsoft will be presenting most of that webinar. I'll be kind of tagging on at the end, but it will be Microsoft presenting it, and it's around security.
I believe one of the first security courses is set out in April. And so everyone will want to stay tuned. We'll have those available on an open enrollment schedule here in the next several weeks. Gidget, another question from Alan Vong. Alan asks, what is the difference between Microsoft 365 Enterprise Administrator and the Azure Administrator, and how to tell which one would be the proper path?
Office 365 Administrator is going to focus around Office 365 products like SharePoint, Exchange. So it's more of that type of product driven, whereas the Azure Administrator is going to be how do you create virtual machines in Azure? You know, what's kind of the costing model in Azure? So it's more general. It would be like a Windows server person, as opposed to, if we look at traditional on-premise, somebody who was Windows server as opposed to a SharePoint administrator. And the proper path for that person that's going to be an Office 365 administrator, I would recommend that you do the Azure Administrator and the Office 365 Administrator, so that you have that foundational knowledge and then you're adding those products into Azure.
And then a question from Paul. Paul says in 2018, He cleared his 7533 and 7535 certifications. But he's looking at the current pathway, and it looks like these certifications don't exist. Does he have to retake the new certification? And what is the easiest path that you would recommend? And just for reference, the 7533 and 7535 were the Azure certifications prior to the role-based certifications being announced.
Okay. Yeah. So you would need to retake those, and you would be in the Azure administrator. So were those administrator, Chris?
I believe
I think it was
they were
administrator and developer, right?
Azure Infrastructure Solutions.
Yeah. So it would be, your proper path would be AZ 104. And then I would go ahead and pursue the architect as well,
Correct.
which
Paul
is
does
303 and
indicate,
304.
yeah, forgive me for interrupting. Paul did indicate it was the Azure Infrastructure Solutions and the architecting. Azure Solutions, it sounds like that pathway, AZ 104 followed by AZ 303 and AZ 304 would be the correct path for you, Paul.
Correct. And Paul, as you study for the AZ 303 and 304, you might study for those together. There's a lot of overlap. One of them addresses the topics from an implementation standpoint, and one of them addresses it from the design standpoint. So same topics, just addressed in a couple of different ways. It's not 100% overlap because the approach is different, but topic-wise, there's some overlap.
While we answer these last few questions, Gidget, perhaps jump ahead. I know there's a special offer for attendees of today's webinar, and we can have those details available for you on the screen so you can take this down. Of course, you can reach out to us anytime with additional questions through our social media outlets. There are some additional resources here for you. And for our students in the US, use webinar 25 on your next course to save 25% with global knowledge. And for any attendees joining from Canada, use CA webinar 25. That same promo code there will allow you to receive 25% off of your next global knowledge course. Robbie has a question regarding SQL Server development. Is there a role-based certification track for SQL Server development, or is there one coming?
So the proper path for you is going to be probably the DP 200 and DP 201. Those are going to be updating soon into the DP 203. So it's a combined, just depending on your timing. But as far as from a development standpoint, it's going to be around those. So the data track is going to be the right one for you. And there's a recent release of the DP 300, which is database administrator for anybody who's maybe currently today you're an on-premise DBA and you want to move into the cloud. So that's the DP 300.
Excellent. Dave Guo did have a question regarding database administration. And so great to hear about the option for DP 300.
And that's a recent release. And I haven't looked at that content specifically, but I've heard from some other instructors that it's quite good.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you, Gidget. We do have time for more questions if any more questions do come in. I hope everyone enjoyed today's webinar. Gidget, I always learn something new each time you have the opportunity to present. I particularly enjoyed the insights on certification and what it means to combine certification with experience, and also the tips, tricks, and best practices for writing Microsoft certification exams are always interesting to hear, especially from your perspective, having had so much experience writing those exams yourself. Again, everybody make sure to visit the Global Knowledge website. You can always access additional free resources like technical articles, white papers, and previous webinars that we've hosted. If there are no, let's see, we've got one more question actually. The best path, Gidget, to become a Microsoft 365, I believe, productivity specialist.
Microsoft 365 productivity specialist.
This terminology may come from the previous MCSA tracks where there was an MCSA productivity certification specifically.
Let me see if I can find that. I don't know the answer. Chris, do you know the answer? Chris is actually Microsoft also. I may, I'll actually get your information and get back to you on that. I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head. And thank you, Chris, for your kind remarks.
You're welcome. And that question comes from Barry Hart. Barry, if you might be able to facilitate a response, I've placed Gidget's contact information in the chat. It's her first name dot last name at globalknowledge.com. And you're welcome to start a quick exchange with Gidget. It's likely going to be somewhere within, there was a question previously about the Microsoft 365 Enterprise Administrator, which is an expert level certification. And within the Microsoft 365 certifications themselves, depending on your role, it's likely you would start with the desktop courses represented by MD 100 and 101. That, or if you're a messaging administrator, there's Exchange content available, Teams content available, and security administration content that's available. So somewhere ahead of the Microsoft 365 Enterprise Administrator courses, you would want to choose the functional area that best represents your role within the organization. But certainly drop Gidget a line and we'll be happy to continue the conversation with you there. And thank you again to everybody for your attendance today. Enjoy the rest of your day.